Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. It started with a whisper in my mind that I tried to shake off, something that felt more like paranoia than fact. For months, I had dismissed the nagging feeling, convincing myself that I was imagining things. I was one of those men who prided himself on trust. After all, that was the foundation of our marriage, wasn't it? I was a decent husband, always showing up for her and believing we were partners for life. But a part of me knew something had changed. It was subtle at first, just small shifts in her behavior, a quick drop of her phone when I walked in the room, glancing away when I'd ask about her day, an unexpected girls' night or last-minute work trip. There was one incident I remember so clearly, a glimpse into the truth she was so desperately hiding. We were on our way to the mountains for a long weekend, a much-needed escape. She'd insisted she needed a break from work, said she was feeling drained. I welcomed it, thinking maybe she just needed a little time away with me to reconnect. I wanted to believe we were still the couple we'd once been. Halfway into the drive, she suddenly asked to stop at a Wawa, needing to use the restroom. Nothing odd about that, I'd had too many cups of coffee myself. She left her phone on the seat, and as I scrolled through mine, her phone lit up. My hand hovered over it for a moment, thoughts racing in the back of my mind. I told myself to ignore it, to respect her privacy, but then I noticed something odd, a VoIP number with a Virginia area code. Before I could react, I saw her rushing out of the Wawa, sprinting like I'd never seen her run before. She looked terrified, almost like someone had taken her by surprise, but I hadn't moved an inch. She practically snatched her phone from my hand, mumbling a quick apology and avoiding my eyes. It was that look, guilt mixed with a poorly masked panic, that sparked a fire in me. I felt something click. Something was horribly, undeniably wrong, but I forced myself to hold back. I decided to wait, let her think everything was fine. This was supposed to be a vacation, and I didn't want to ruin it without proof. The next few days were uncomfortable, to say the least. She was constantly on her phone, glued to it like a lifeline. If I dared to make a joke about it, she brushed it off, claiming she was doing a survey for work. The whole thing felt absurd, like a twisted joke. By the end of our trip, the doubt gnawed at me like a physical ache. Every smile, every conversation felt tainted, clouded by the thought that maybe the woman I loved was leading a double life right under my nose. When we got home, I couldn't shake the feeling. I needed answers. The first thing I did was pull up her phone bill online. I'm not proud of it, I felt like a spy, a stranger in my own marriage, but I was done letting suspicion fester in the dark. My hands shook as I scrolled through the call log, scanning through hundreds of messages and calls, mostly benign. But there it was again, that same Virginia number, showing up day after day, at odd hours, and always lengthy calls. This wasn't a work thing, I knew that much. I decided to trace it. I used an online service to look up the number, expecting it to be unlisted or a dead end. But no, it was a VoIP number, designed for anonymity. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever she was talking to didn't want to be found, didn't want their identity linked to a real phone number. My mind spun with possibilities, none of them good. It was like a switch flipped in me. I couldn't keep living like this, teetering between hope and suspicion. I started paying attention, piecing together the fragmented clues she hadn't even realized she'd left behind. Her work trips, her constant excuses, the way she'd suddenly grown distant, more defensive if I asked too many questions. She had a pattern, a routine that was meticulously designed to keep me in the dark. One evening, I took a calculated risk. She was out on one of her work trips, staying overnight in the city. I opened her laptop, heart racing, and began searching through her emails. Most of it was routine correspondence with colleagues, mundane work emails, nothing out of place. But then I found a folder, marked with a simple, miscellaneous, inside were a few emails to a name I didn't recognize, Kevin. It was all there, in black and white. The tone of the messages was subtle, restrained even, but I could read between the lines. There were little jokes, phrases only two people who shared something intimate would understand. She wrote about how much she enjoyed seeing him, the highlight of her trip, and he'd replied with something just as sickeningly sweet. They had a history, a familiarity that stung in every line. She signed off with a phrase I'd once thought was ours alone, "I can't wait until next time." I felt sick. Anger surged through me, burning away every ounce of affection I had for her. She'd lied, betrayed me in ways I hadn't thought possible. But even through the pain, a strange clarity settled in my mind. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. She would see it coming, twist it around somehow, and I'd be the one left feeling insane. No, I needed more. If she thought she could play me for a fool, I'd show her just how wrong she was. In the days that followed, I became a master of pretending. Every smile, every affectionate gesture I gave her was a mask, covering up the plan that was forming inside me. I kept it light, made her believe nothing had changed. She went about her days with a blissful ignorance, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew everything. I'd wait, build my case piece by piece, letting her dig her own grave. The game was on, and I was ready for whatever came next. After that night, something shifted in me. Knowing the truth made it impossible to ignore the details I'd once brushed off. The way she'd laugh a little too freely when her phone chimed, her mood brightening as though some unseen light had turned on. But the more time I spent watching her, the more she gave herself away, slipping into a strange, detached happiness that left me feeling like an outsider in my own home. It was almost poetic, the way she seemed to unravel, completely unaware of how carefully I was keeping track. I became an expert at waiting, holding back my rage, keeping it simmering under a thin layer of control. I started noticing patterns in her lies, the little routines she'd set up to cover her tracks. The truth was so ugly, yet she wrapped it up in the banalities of everyday life, thinking I'd never notice. One Friday night, she claimed she'd be working late, a last-minute client dinner that had come up unexpectedly. She kissed me on the cheek and hurried out, leaving a faint trail of perfume in her wake. As I watched her drive off, a strange sense of relief washed over me. This time, I was ready. I'd waited for a night like this to act, biding my time until her lies created the perfect opportunity. The moment she was out of sight, I grabbed my keys and left, careful to keep a few cars behind her. She wasn't exactly subtle, heading to a part of town I knew well, a place where business dinners rarely involved actual business. I trailed her to a high-rise hotel and watched as she stepped out of the car, adjusting her dress and fixing her hair. She checked her phone, glanced around, and headed inside. I sat in my car, letting the anger settle into something colder, sharper. I hadn't planned to confront her yet, but seeing her walk into that hotel shifted something inside me. It was as though all the pieces clicked into place, forming a truth I could no longer ignore. She wasn't just cheating, she'd built an entire world outside of ours, a place where I didn't exist. After an hour of waiting, I knew I needed something concrete. The anger wasn't enough. I needed proof, something undeniable, something she couldn't spin. I went home, opened her laptop, and searched through every app, every file, every hidden folder. And there it was, buried under layers of mundane work files and spreadsheets, a series of photos, messages, receipts from hotels, restaurants, places she'd visited with him. Each photo, each message felt like a slap in the face. They were intimate, casual, as if I was the one who'd invaded their private world. She had pictures of the two of them, laughing, holding hands, even one of them in a dimly lit restaurant where she looked happier than she had with me in years. The anger grew into something uncontainable, a storm building inside me. This was more than a one-time fling, it was a full-blown affair, woven into the fabric of her life. She'd built a future with him in secret, leaving me in the dark while she danced through her lies. There were messages where they planned weekends together, discussions about places they wanted to visit, things they'd do once she was free. She'd strung me along, playing the devoted wife while laying the groundwork for an escape I hadn't even seen coming. But the worst part? The part that burned me alive? She had him saved in her phone as Kevin, work, a casual label that was just another layer of her deception. The lies weren't just to me, she'd lied to herself, pretending this was just a harmless escape, some fleeting joy she was entitled to. In her mind, she was justified, free to take whatever she wanted while I held down the life we'd built together. I was ready to confront her, to throw every shred of evidence in her face and watch her squirm. But then another thought crept in, a thought darker and colder than my rage. Why give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd hurt me? Why let her see the pain she'd caused? No, there was a better way, a way that would hurt her far more than any confrontation ever could. I started making plans, subtle changes she wouldn't notice. I opened a separate bank account, rerouting funds into it bit by bit. I began sorting through our shared finances, taking note of everything I'd need to cover when I walked away from her for good. Every night, after she drifted off to sleep, I'd slip out of bed and continue my preparations, watching her sleep peacefully, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. I'd done nothing wrong, yet here I was, living like a thief in my own home, carefully plotting my escape from the woman who'd betrayed me. And as the weeks went on, my resolve hardened. I could see it all so clearly now, the lies, the manipulation, the way she'd looked me in the eye every day and lied to my face. She was living a fantasy, but I'd make sure that fantasy ended with nothing but ashes. One night, I decided to give her a taste of what was coming. We were having dinner, a quiet meal at home, and she seemed distant, as if her mind was elsewhere. I watched her, wondering what she'd tell me if she knew I'd been watching her every move. "So, how's work been?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked up, a bit startled, and offered a practiced smile. "Oh, it's been fine. Busy, you know. Lots of projects." Her eyes darted away, the slightest flicker of guilt in her expression. "Any new clients?" I pressed, enjoying the way she fidgeted under my gaze. She hesitated, her fingers playing with her fork, before nodding. "Yeah, actually. There's this new project in Richmond, so I might need to travel a bit." Her voice was smooth, almost too smooth, and I could tell she was already preparing her next excuse. I nodded, hiding my smile. "Richmond, huh? Sounds interesting. Maybe I'll tag along one of these times." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face before she quickly covered it up. "Oh, it's just work stuff, nothing exciting," she replied, her voice a bit too quick, a bit too defensive. The satisfaction I felt was unlike anything I'd ever known. She was scared, caught off guard, and it thrilled me. I'd let her play her little games, let her weave her web of lies while I watched her fall deeper into her own trap. In the weeks that followed, I kept up the act, smiling, playing the devoted husband, and gathering every bit of evidence I could find. I was meticulous, leaving no trace of my preparations. I wanted her to believe that nothing had changed, that she was still the clever, cunning woman she thought she was. She had no idea that I'd seen through her, that every word she spoke was just another nail in her own coffin. The more she lied, the more my resolve grew. I'd let her think she'd won, let her bask in her secret life, while I waited in the shadows, biding my time. When the day finally came, I'd make sure she felt the full weight of her betrayal. And when I walked away, leaving her with nothing but the pieces of her broken fantasy, she'd finally understand just how wrong she'd been. The day of reckoning was closer than ever, and as I watched my plans come together, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and bitterness. Each day was an exercise in patience, my anger simmering just below the surface. I'd always been a man of control, but this was testing me in ways I hadn't known I could endure. It was early morning when the first part of my plan kicked into motion. My wife, oblivious to the changes around her, was getting ready for yet another trip. This time, she'd told me she was heading to Chicago for a big client meeting, emphasizing how it might be her most important work trip yet. I nodded, acting supportive, hiding my contempt behind a placid smile. Little did she know, I'd spent the past week laying down every detail for what was to come. I had to leave before her that morning, so I made my coffee as usual and kissed her on the cheek. "Good luck on your trip," I said, keeping my tone as casual as I could. She gave me that rehearsed smile, probably believing she'd pulled off her deceit yet again. "Thanks, babe," she replied, turning back to her suitcase, already half-zipped. Her mind was elsewhere, clearly, and she barely noticed as I slipped out the door. I wondered if she'd thought about the impact of her lies, or if, in her mind, I was just another piece in her comfortable little life. But that would all change soon. The first thing I did was confirm the private investigator's findings. He'd been following her movements for the past few weeks, tracking her meetings with Kevin. He'd gotten me everything: photos, time stamps, even hotel receipts confirming that she'd been meeting him while claiming to be on these business trips. The evidence was damning, and I'd had it compiled into a neat folder on my laptop. But that wasn't the real plan. My plan went far beyond simply catching her. It was about leaving her in ruins, just as she'd left my trust. Later that evening, after work, I began setting up the digital evidence. I created a private, password-protected online file, labeling it with a vague title so it wouldn't catch her eye if she happened to use the computer. I uploaded every email, every photo, and every piece of information I'd gathered about her double life. I wanted a safe place for it all, a hidden vault that only I could access. That evening, she returned home from her trip, the same glossy-eyed smile on her face, as if she'd just wrapped up another successful workday. She hugged me, kissed me lightly, and headed straight to the shower. I watched her disappear down the hall, feeling a surge of disgust. But as much as I hated her deceit, I kept the anger at bay, saving it for the right moment. The following morning, while she was out on a supposed coffee run with friends, I started putting the next steps in place. First, I contacted the bank to ensure that the new account was ready for transfers. I'd gradually shifted a substantial amount of our joint funds there, careful to leave enough in our primary account to keep her from growing suspicious. It was astonishing how easy it was to reroute everything under her nose. Her focus was so tied up in her fantasy life that she hadn't even noticed. Next came the legal preparations. I'd spoken to a lawyer discreetly, outlining everything. The lawyer had assured me that with the evidence I'd gathered, a favorable divorce settlement was all but guaranteed. Knowing her propensity to manipulate, I was certain she'd try to plead her case, but with every piece of evidence I held, she'd have no ground to stand on. I gave her no hints, letting her believe we were still the same blissfully unaware couple we'd always been. Over dinner that evening, she started talking about an upcoming business conference in Atlanta, saying how she'd be out of town for an extra day, to catch up with a feign clients. She didn't realize it, but her lies were practically stacking themselves up for her. "Sounds like you'll have a busy week," I replied, feigning interest. She nodded, her face lighting up with that same smug satisfaction, and I had to look away to hide my disgust. She believed she had everything under control, that she could keep me in the dark while she played out her twisted game. I played along, giving her nothing to suspect. On the day she left for her Atlanta conference, I began the final phase of my plan. I contacted our friends, inviting them to a gathering that weekend. I told them it was to celebrate a big change coming in my life, making sure to keep things vague. Some of them seemed curious, others a bit surprised, but they all agreed to come. It was a mixture of close friends, neighbors, and even a few of her colleagues who'd always been close to us. With the party set, I spent the next 2 days preparing everything in the house, setting up for the night that would end everything she thought she knew. She had no idea that I'd invited her colleagues, her closest friends, all people who would see her for who she really was. By the time she returned, exhausted and visibly worn, she had no idea that her world was about to implode. On the night of the gathering, our friends started arriving, greeting me warmly, bringing wine and flowers. I smiled, welcoming them, keeping up the charade of a casual get-together. I noticed a few of her friends glancing around, probably wondering why she wasn't there, but I kept the conversation light. I didn't want them suspecting anything, yet. Finally, she arrived, caught off guard by the sight of a crowd in our living room. She looked at me, bewildered, as if she couldn't understand why we'd have a party without her knowledge. "Surprise," I said, grinning. "Thought it would be nice to get everyone together for a change." She forced a smile, trying to act as though she wasn't completely thrown off. I could see her glancing around, wondering if Kevin might be here, perhaps regretting that she hadn't invited him. As the night wore on, I could tell she was growing more comfortable, laughing and mingling with her friends, even as I watched her with barely veiled contempt. Finally, when the moment felt right, I called everyone's attention, tapping my glass to gather them around. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice calm and steady. "There's something I want to share with all of you. It's a bit of a revelation, you could say." She looked at me, her smile freezing as her eyes filled with a hint of unease. "Babe, what's this all about?" I looked her in the eyes, feeling nothing but cold resolve. "It's about the truth. About you, and about what you've been doing behind my back." A murmur rippled through the crowd as everyone exchanged confused glances. I kept my gaze steady on her, watching as the realization started to dawn on her. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "I've spent the past few months gathering everything," I continued. "The emails, the hotel receipts, the photos. Every lie you've told, every time you've betrayed me. I know everything, and now, so do they." The room fell silent as her face drained of color. She looked around, pleadingly, as if hoping someone might defend her, but no one spoke. Everyone was stunned, the weight of her betrayal hanging thick in the air. I took out my phone, pulling up the evidence I'd stored, and passed it to a close friend who glanced at the images and messages with a look of horror. One by one, they saw the proof, realizing just how deep her betrayal ran. The whispers began, soft gasps and mutters as the crowd took in the evidence. Her closest friends looked at her with a mix of pity and disgust, the facade she'd so carefully maintained crumbling before her eyes. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but her voice cracked, and she couldn't bring herself to look at anyone. I watched her struggle, watched the way her hands trembled, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm. I'd taken back the control she thought she'd stolen from me, leaving her exposed for what she was. I could tell from the look on her face that she finally understood. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The life she'd thought she could keep intact had been torn apart in front of everyone who'd mattered to her. And as I watched her wilt under their gaze, I knew my work was done. The crowd thinned out one by one, friends murmuring awkward goodbyes, some offering me sympathetic pats on the shoulder. A few of her close friends lingered a little longer, looking torn between comforting her and condemning her, but they eventually slipped out as well, leaving just the two of us in silence. She sat on the couch, stunned, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. The vibrant, smug woman I'd watched flaunt her double life was gone, replaced by someone broken and unsure, barely able to meet my gaze. I couldn't find a shred of sympathy for her. All I felt was a strange emptiness. I'd gotten my revenge, but now that the moment was over, the victory felt hollow, leaving only a void where my anger had been. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "How could you do this, here, like this?" Her eyes held a glint of defiance, as if she wanted to blame me for tearing her world apart. "How could I?" I scoffed, feeling the anger rekindle just slightly. "How could you, night after night, lie to my face, lead me around like a fool? Did you think you'd get away with it forever?" Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, her face softened, the tears spilling over. I didn't know how to stop it, how to tell you. It just happened, and by the time I realized what I was doing, her voice cracked, and she looked down, twisting her hands nervously. Silence stretched between us, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her, to think that maybe this woman was capable of regret. But my resolve hardened as I recalled all the lies, the deceit, the smug look she'd worn every time she thought she'd gotten away with it. I wasn't about to let her off so easily. "I don't care," I said coldly. "You can have your excuses, your justifications. None of that matters to me anymore." She took a shaky breath and looked up at me, desperation gleaming in her eyes. "Please, we can work this out. We've built a life together, we can find a way past this." I laughed bitterly. "Work it out? You don't get it, do you? There's nothing left to work out. I don't want you, and I don't want anything that ties me to you." I glanced around the living room, taking in the last traces of the life we'd shared. In my mind, I had already let it go. Just as I turned to leave, she broke down completely, sobbing openly. She reached out, catching my arm in a weak grip. "Please, please. I know I've made mistakes, but we can start over. I can change, I'll be the woman you want me to be." She clung to me, her voice desperate, almost frantic. Something twisted in me, and for the briefest moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But then, out of nowhere, a voice broke the silence. "Actually, she won't have the chance to try." The voice was calm, firm, and it came from the doorway. I turned, and there he was, Kevin, her soulmate. He'd arrived uninvited, standing there as if he'd been waiting all evening. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a gleam of confidence, as if he'd expected this moment. I felt a surge of confusion, then anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded. He stepped forward, ignoring my tone, his gaze fixed on my wife. "I knew she'd need someone to pick up the pieces," he said calmly, his voice filled with an unsettling authority. "You're done here, but I'm not." Her expression twisted, a mixture of shock and relief, as if she'd been waiting for a lifeline and he'd appeared right on cue. She staggered toward him, her face pleading. "Kevin, I didn't think you'd come. I thought." He cut her off with a cold look. "Oh, I came because it's time to tell you the truth. The whole truth." My wife looked taken aback, a tremor of fear flickering in her eyes. She took a small step back, clearly uneasy. What are you talking about?" He smiled, a smug, twisted smile that made my skin crawl. "This has all been a game to me, one that you never even realized you were playing." He glanced at me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "And I think it's time you both know exactly what's been going on." My jaw clenched as I listened, struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice laced with dread. Kevin smirked, crossing his arms. "Did you really think you were special? That I'd throw everything away for someone like you? You were an easy distraction, someone to pass the time. Nothing more." He looked at me, his tone shifting to something sharper. "I've been with plenty of women, but your wife. She was desperate, and she'd believe anything I told her. I just wanted to see how far she'd go." She stared at him, horrified, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process his words. "No, you said, you promised." He laughed, low and cruel. "Oh, I promised you a lot of things, didn't I? But I never meant a single one. You're not the first woman to fall for it, and I'm sure you won't be the last." I looked at her, watching as her face crumbled, the realization hitting her like a sledgehammer. This was the man she'd betrayed me for, the man she thought was her escape. And he'd used her, toyed with her, only to discard her now that the game was over. You don't mean that," she stammered, her voice a thin thread of disbelief. Kevin shrugged, his expression utterly indifferent. "Believe whatever you want. But don't expect me to pick up the pieces. This is where I walk away." He turned to me, giving me a slight nod, almost as if he respected me. "You won, in the end. Good luck with whatever comes next." And just like that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving her shattered, her world crumbling around her. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, utterly defeated. She looked up at me, her face broken, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do. Please, don't leave me. I have no one." For the first time that night, I felt a strange calm settle over me, an unexpected sense of release. I looked down at her, realizing that I'd already left her long ago, even if she hadn't known it. The woman before me was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize or want to know. "I think you've done enough damage on your own," I said quietly. "Goodbye." Without another word, I walked out, leaving her there, her broken sobs echoing behind me. I didn't look back. The air felt fresh and crisp as I stepped outside, the weight of betrayal finally lifted from my shoulders. And in that moment, as I breathed in the cool night air, I realized that my life, the life I wanted, was just beginning.